had gone camping alone that summer, one of those trips I sometimes took just to get away from people and noise. I picked a small clearing near a creek, a place I'd camped before, surrounded by thick woods with only deer trails cutting through. The air was warm and heavy, the kind of thick heat that makes the ground smell alive with dirt and plants. I set up my tent, built a fire pit from rocks nearby, and gathered enough wood to last me into the night. By late afternoon, I was sweating through my shirt, so I decided to walk down to the creek to cool off. The water was shallow, no more than knee-deep, but it was cold and clear, running quick over stones. I knelt down, splashed some on my face, and let it run through my hands. It was the kind of relief you look forward to on hot days, the shock of cold waking you up and clearing your head. When I walked back to camp, I noticed something strange off to the side of the clearing. It looked like a shape low to the ground, half hidden behind tall grass. At first, I thought it was just a fallen log or maybe a pile of brush left over from a storm. But when I walked closer, I saw it wasn't either of those things. It was a figure, not alive but made of things from the woods. Someone had built what looked almost like a man, pieced together from sticks, grass, and clumps of mud. A head was shaped from packed dirt, held up with branches jammed into the ground as a kind of frame. Arms stretched out unevenly from the sides, long sticks tied with vines. Grass had been woven or stuffed in places to give it bulk, like someone had tried to make it lifelike. It was the summertime version of building a snowman, only instead of snow, it was mud and sticks and weeds. The sight of it made me stop cold. It wasn't just that it was there, it was how fresh it looked. The mud was still damp, dark and pliable. The grass hadn't dried or browned yet. Someone had built it recently, maybe within hours, and it was standing just a short distance from where I had set up my tent. I stood staring at it for a long time, the air around me suddenly feeling heavier. I kept waiting for some sign that it was a joke, something left behind by kids, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone else around. Just this figure, crude and silent, standing there as though it had been watching while I set up camp. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe someone else camping here before me had built it for fun, like stacking rocks or carving initials into a tree. I went back to my fire pit, lit the fire, and cooked a simple meal, but I couldn't stop glancing over at the figure through the flames. In the flickering light, it looked even stranger, its stick arms casting long, thin shadows across the grass. When night fell, the forest sounds grew louder, the high-pitched calls of insects, the distant croak of frogs, the rustle of small animals moving through leaves. I should have felt at ease the way I normally did on these trips, but instead I felt watched. Every time I turned my head toward that figure, I half expected it to be closer, but it stayed where it was, slouched and crooked, arms sticking out at awkward angles. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flaps shut, and lay on my back. The fire burned down outside, leaving only faint pops as the last coals cracked. Inside, it was hot and close, and I found myself sweating against the sleeping bag. My ears tuned into every sound, the wind pushing through the trees, the creek running nearby, the constant drone of insects. And then, faintly, something else. It sounded like movement in the grass, a slow swish, as though something or someone was brushing through it carefully. I held still, heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound didn't last long. After a few moments, it stopped, replaced once again by the normal noise of the woods. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I forced myself to stay put, though sleep didn't come easy. When dawn broke, I stepped out of the tent and scanned the clearing. Everything looked the same except for one thing. The figure had changed. It wasn't where it had been the night before. It was closer now, moved several feet nearer to the fire pit. Its posture seemed different, too. The head tilted slightly, one arm raised higher than before, as if it had shifted in the night. I froze, staring at it, the chill of fear cutting through the heat of the morning. I knew I hadn't imagined where it was. I remembered clearly the spot it had stood in when I cooked dinner. Now it was closer, unmistakably closer. I backed up toward my tent, trying to think. There was no sign of footprints, no sign of anyone else nearby. Just that same crude figure, damp mud and sticks, leaning toward camp as though it had been inching closer while I slept. I couldn't stand the thought of staying another night out there. I packed quickly, breaking down the tent, smothering what was left of the fire. Every time I turned my back, I felt the weight of the figure behind me, as though it might move again if I stopped looking. My hands shook as I shoved gear into my pack. When everything was loaded, I turned for one last look. The figure stood there in the clearing, its head cocked at that same unnatural angle, arms stretched wide. In the daylight, I could see that the mud on its body had cracked slightly, flaking off in spots where the sun had already started drying it. But that didn't make it less unnerving. It stood like a marker, like something left behind on purpose, a warning or a sign. I left quickly, following the trail back toward the road, glancing over my shoulder more times than I could count. Every shift of wind through the grass made me jump. I didn't stop until I reached my car, threw my gear inside, and shut the door. Driving away, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it had been a prank, some strange art left behind by people passing through. Maybe animals had knocked it over, making it look different in the morning. But none of those explanations fit what I had seen. Someone had built that figure fresh, someone had placed it near my camp, and by the next day it had been moved closer. The woods are full of things you can explain if you try hard enough. Animal tracks, broken branches, noises in the night. But that figure, made from mud and sticks and grass, is something I can't explain away. It wasn't just a harmless sculpture. It felt intentional, personal, like it was meant to be seen. That's why I've never gone back to that spot. The memory of it still sits with me. The damp mud, the crooked arms, the slow realization that I wasn't alone out there. I can handle the ordinary dangers of the woods. Snakes, storms, getting lost. But not that. Not something built and left behind with no reason. Watching from the edge of camp, inching closer while I slept. It was the summertime version of building a snowman, only far from harmless fun. It was something darker, something that didn't belong in those woods, and I still can't shake the thought of what might have happened if I'd stayed one more night. The night started out calm. My family had turned in after a long day of hiking and setting up camp, leaving me alone by the fire with my dog. It was the kind of quiet you only get deep in the woods, where the usual background hum of traffic or neighbors is gone, replaced by the crackle of flames, the occasional pop from the wood, and the soft rustling of wind through the trees. I sat in my folding chair, a half-empty can of beer sweating in my hand, just enjoying the last bit of stillness before heading into the tent myself. My dog was curled at my feet at first, relaxed, eyes half shut but still awake. He's the kind of dog who notices everything, and I've learned to pay attention when his ears perk up or when he shifts his posture. For a while, he was calm, breathing steady, the firelight glinting off his fur. But then something changed. It was subtle at first. His head snapped up, ears standing rigid, eyes fixed into the dark beyond the fire's glow. His body went tense, muscles stiff, and a low rumble started deep in his chest. I paused mid-sip, beer hovering in my hand, and followed his gaze. But all I could see was the black wall of trees at the edge of camp. I set the can down and grabbed my flashlight from the cooler. His growl grew louder, vibrating through the air, steady and unbroken. The kind of sound dogs only make when they know something is there. I swept the beam of light slowly across the treeline, moving left to right. My heart was beating harder now, each breath heavier than the last. Then I saw it. 2 glowing eyes caught in the light. They were low, steady, and unblinking. My brain took a second to process what I was looking at, but when the outline of the body behind them became clear, my stomach dropped. It was a mountain lion. It stood about 100 yards away, perfectly still, its body low to the ground, tail swishing slowly back and forth. The eyes locked on me, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like 2 sharp coins in the dark. The cat wasn't moving closer, but it wasn't running off either. It was just there, watching. The fire popped beside me, sending a spray of sparks into the air, but I barely noticed. My entire focus was on that animal. My dog was straining against his leash now, barking and growling, pulling toward it, ready to defend me but also putting us in more danger. I tightened my grip on the leash, my other hand trembling slightly as I kept the flashlight trained on the cat. I tried to think clearly, but my mind was racing. Mountain lions are ambush predators. If you see one, there's a good chance it's been watching you for a while already, testing the situation, deciding if you're worth the risk. That thought hit me harder than anything. The idea that this wasn't the first moment it had noticed me. Could have been there for minutes, maybe longer, watching me sit at the fire, listening to my dog breathe, smelling the food scraps from our dinner. The woods felt completely different in that moment. What had seemed calm and safe just minutes before was now alive with threat. Every shadow felt like it could hide another set of eyes. Every sound, the shifting of branches, the distant crack of a twig, made me flinch. The lion didn't move, but that almost made it worse. It stood there, statuesque, muscles taut, as if it could spring forward at any second. I remembered reading somewhere that you should never run, that it can trigger their instinct to chase. Instead, you're supposed to make yourself big, hold your ground, keep eye contact, and make noise. But knowing what you're supposed to do and actually doing it when you're staring at a wild predator in the dark are two very different things. My dog kept pulling, barking so loud it echoed off the trees, but the lion stayed rooted, tail still swinging slowly like a pendulum. I started yelling, clapping, stomping my boots into the dirt, anything to break the standoff. My voice cracked in the middle of the shouting, not from lack of breath but from the adrenaline tearing through me. Finally, after what felt like forever, the cat blinked and turned its head slightly. It shifted its body, graceful even in its retreat, and stepped back into the brush. For a moment, its eyes flashed again in the beam of my flashlight, and then they disappeared. The darkness swallowed it whole. I kept the light fixed on the treeline for a long time after, half expecting it to reappear. My dog never stopped growling, low and steady, even as I stirred the fire higher and tried to convince myself it was gone. I didn't feel safe, though, not even close. I knew enough about these animals to know that just because I couldn't see it didn't mean it wasn't there anymore. It could have circled us, hidden itself deeper in the brush, and kept watching. After a while, I grabbed the rest of the wood and piled it onto the fire. The flames leapt higher, throwing light further into the clearing, though it still barely touched the edges of the trees. My family was asleep in the tents just a few yards away, unaware of what had just happened. I thought about waking them, but then I wondered if that would just cause panic. I decided to sit up the rest of the night, keeping the fire alive, flashlight and dog at my side. The hours dragged on slowly. Every few minutes, I'd sweep the light across the treeline again, my stomach knotting each time the beam caught on a branch that looked too much like a crouched shape or a rock that gleamed like eyes. My dog never fully calmed, though his barking gave way to soft whines and alert stares into the dark. By the time dawn broke, the forest finally felt lighter, less threatening, though the memory of those glowing eyes stayed sharp in my mind. My family stirred awake, yawning and stretching, completely unaware of how close we might have been to real danger. I didn't tell them everything right away. I just said I'd stayed up with the fire, left out the part about the predator that had stood just beyond the reach of its light. Later, when we packed up camp and loaded the car, I couldn't stop myself from looking back at the treeline one last time. The woods seemed peaceful again, harmless even. But I knew better now. I knew that the quiet doesn't mean you're alone. It just means that whatever's out there hasn't chosen to show itself yet. That thought has stuck with me ever since. The mountain lion I saw was probably only one of the times I've been close to one without knowing it. How many nights have I sat by a fire or walked a trail, thinking I was safe, while eyes watched from the shadows, waiting, silent and unseen? It's a question I'll never have the answer to, and that's what makes it the most unsettling part of all. It was one of those days where the weather was just about perfect. The air was warm but not hot. The sun filtered down through the trees, and the trail was quiet enough that you felt like you had the woods mostly to yourself. I had my dog on the leash, and my mom was walking with us. It was supposed to be a calm, easy hike, nothing too long or difficult, just a few miles through forest trails before looping back toward the car. For the first stretch, everything felt normal. My dog was trotting along beside me, tail wagging, nose to the ground, excited the way dogs always get when they're in new territory. We stopped a couple times to take water breaks, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the dirt and the occasional bird overhead. It was the kind of outing where you let your guard down, where you don't think much about what could be out there because everything feels so peaceful. That changed in an instant. I noticed it first in the way my dog's ears went up. She froze mid-step, her whole body stiff, tail low and tight. She sniffed the air hard, quick breaths in and out, and then she started growling low in her throat. At first, I thought maybe she'd caught the scent of another hiker's dog, or maybe some deer ahead on the trail. But the growl deepened, and when she suddenly lunged forward on the leash, it was like she was trying to break free from me. I held tight, planting my feet, but she nearly pulled me over. She was straining against the leash so hard that her front paws were digging at the dirt, pulling with everything she had. The sound she was making wasn't her usual bark when she saw a squirrel or something harmless. This was different. It was panicked, desperate, like she thought her life was in danger. I looked around, scanning the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The trail curved ahead, and the forest was thick on both sides, branches tangled, undergrowth so dense that you couldn't see more than a few feet past the first line of trees. I felt the back of my neck prickle, that instinctive sense that something is watching you, even though you can't see it. My mom had stopped a few steps behind me. She looked uneasy too, her eyes darting toward the tree line. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was thinking the same thing I was. Something was out there, something we couldn't see. My dog kept fighting the leash, whining now, jerking to the side as if she was trying to bolt into the woods. I had to use both hands to hold her back, my arms straining against her weight. It crossed my mind that if I hadn't had her on the leash, she would have been gone. Straight into the trees, gone in seconds. The thought chilled me because if she was that terrified, whatever was out there wasn't just some harmless animal. Dogs know. They smell and sense things we can't. The more I thought about it, the more the answer became clear. This was mountain lion country. Sightings weren't rare, and the dense cover of the woods was perfect for one to hide in. If a lion had been shadowing us, we'd never know until it wanted us to. That was the scariest part. How silent they are, how they stalk without a sound until they're ready to strike. I tried to keep walking, moving steady but not fast, hoping that if we acted calm, whatever was out there would stay away. But my dog made it nearly impossible. She was jerking and pulling, growling one moment, whining the next, twisting her body to look behind us, then forward, then off to the side. It was like she couldn't decide where the danger was because it was circling us. The hike that had felt so peaceful minutes ago turned into the longest, most nerve-wracking stretch of trail I've ever walked. Every sound made me flinch, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, even the wind moving through the branches. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see eyes staring back at me. My mom's pace had quickened, and I could feel the tension radiating off her. We didn't have to say anything to each other. We both knew. The dog's leash burned against my hand from the constant pulling. She wanted to run so badly, and I knew that if she did, the mountain lion, if that's what it was, might follow her, and that could mean all of us were in even more danger. Holding her back felt like the only thing keeping her alive, maybe keeping us alive too. Time dragged on. The trail seemed to stretch forever, even though it was only a mile or so back to the car. I kept thinking about what it would be like if one of us had been alone. No dog to warn us, no second person to share the fear, just me out there with nothing but the sound of something unseen moving through the woods. The thought of it made my skin crawl. Eventually, the trees thinned, and I caught sight of the clearing where the trailhead opened up to the parking area. Relief washed over me so hard I almost stumbled. My dog was still pulling, still frantic, but as we stepped out into the open space, her body slowly started to relax. She kept glancing back at the woods, though ears still pinned, like she didn't quite believe we were safe yet. We got to the car and loaded her in, and I can't describe the relief I felt closing the doors. It was like the thin layer of metal was the only thing separating us from something we were never meant to see. I sat there catching my breath, heart still pounding, while my mom stared out the window at the dark line of trees. We never saw anything. No shadow moving between the trees, no shape crouched in the brush. But that made it worse in a way. Knowing that something was there, something powerful enough to terrify a dog who'd never backed down from anything before, and never catching a glimpse of it. It left me unsettled in a way I can't put into words. The hike back might have ended, but that feeling stuck with me for days. Even now, when I think about it, the image that plays in my head is of a mountain lion, low to the ground, moving silently through the underbrush just out of sight, its eyes fixed on us the entire time. My dog was the only one who knew it for sure, the only one who could sense it, and without her, I might have walked that trail without ever realizing I was being followed. What scared me the most wasn't the idea of the lion attacking, though that thought was terrifying enough. It was the reminder of how invisible real danger can be in the wild, how close it can get without you ever knowing until it decides to show itself. That day, it didn't, and that's the only reason I'm here to remember it. I never thought something as innocent sounding as the idea of a summertime snowman could turn into a memory that would stay with me forever. It was one of those things that seemed harmless at first, almost playful in a strange way, but by the time the sun had gone down and I lay in my tent staring at the thin nylon walls around me, I felt a kind of dread that was hard to explain. Looking back now, I can trace the whole thing step by step, from the moment it started as a joke to the way it shifted into something much darker. It was mid-July, the heat sitting heavy over everything, and I had gone camping alone for the weekend. I was in a clearing not far from a lake, with tall trees circling the area, their leaves so thick that the air underneath felt damp and muffled. The bugs were thick, buzzing around constantly, and the smell of pine needles and warm earth hung in the air. I had set up my tent near the edge of the tree line, giving myself enough room for a fire and a place to sit without being too exposed in the middle of the clearing. During the day, I walked around the woods, not really hiking with a purpose, but just wandering. I liked to look at things I found: fallen logs, strange mushrooms, little animal trails that cut through the underbrush. I remember thinking that day that the woods felt unusually still, like the animals were quiet in a way that wasn't normal. Usually, you'd hear birds or the scurrying of something small, but the sound was faint, distant. It was during one of those walks that I got the idea. I had come across a patch of long grass near the lake. It had been cut down at some point, probably by fishermen trying to clear space, and the bundles of it lay scattered around like hay bales. The sight reminded me of winters at home when we used to roll big balls of snow to stack into snowmen. I remember thinking, kind of jokingly to myself, that this was like the summertime version of building a snowman. Instead of snow, there was grass and weeds and sticks. I started piling some of it together, first just for something to do. I bundled an armful of dried grass and set it upright, then added more to bulk it out. Before long, I had built up something about the size of a person. I propped it with a couple of fallen branches to keep it from collapsing, then started adding more to make it thicker, shaping it. I gave it a sort of head by rolling a tighter bundle and setting it on top. Then, without even thinking too hard about it, I started adding details: rocks for eyes, a broken piece of bark for a mouth, a couple of sticks poking out for arms. First, it was funny. It didn't look good, just a rough figure made of weeds and sticks, but it was big enough that it stood out against the backdrop of the trees. I stepped back and looked at it, wiping sweat from my forehead, and for a moment it just seemed like some harmless little project, something to laugh about later. But the longer I stood there staring at it, the stranger it seemed. The thing wasn't perfect, but it had a shape that was too human. The arms stuck out in awkward angles, and the head sagged a little to one side, but it stood there, tall and silent, staring back at me with its dark rock eyes. I told myself it was nothing, just a pile of grass and sticks, and I left it there, heading back to my camp as the day wore on. But I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder more than once as I walked back. The figure stood still in the patch of cut grass, and I could still see it when I turned around, its shape sharp against the sky. That night, I cooked a small dinner over the fire and sat listening to the woods. The sun went down slow, and the light faded to blue and then to black. The fire crackled and gave me just enough comfort to keep from feeling alone. But at some point, I thought about the figure again. I realized I had built it not far from where my tent was, maybe just a couple 100 feet away. The thought of it standing there in the dark, shaped like a person, started to gnaw at me. I tried not to think about it, but it was the kind of thing that once in your head doesn't leave. Every crack of a branch out in the woods, every faint rustle of grass made me picture that shape moving, like it had shifted from where I left it. I found myself staring into the dark between the trees, looking for a silhouette that I knew I didn't want to see. At some point, I couldn't sit there anymore, so I put out the fire and went into my tent. I zipped it up tight and lay on my sleeping bag, listening. The night was hot, but I didn't dare leave the flap open. I just lay there sweating, my ears tuned to every small sound outside. That's when I thought I heard something, just faint, like the dragging of grass along the ground. A slow scrape. I held my breath, waiting, straining to hear. For a long time there was nothing, just the buzzing of insects. Finally, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. But then I smelled it. A sharp, green smell, like fresh-cut weeds mixed with the damp rot of the ground. It was faint, but it seemed too close, like the smell you'd get if you'd been handling piles of grass and dirt. My stomach turned, and I pulled my sleeping bag up even though the heat was suffocating. The night dragged on like that. I didn't sleep much at all. Every sound, every smell made my heart pound. I kept telling myself it was just the thing I had made, still standing in that patch of grass, still just sitting there. But my mind wouldn't let it go. The thought of it being out there in the dark, shaped like a person, with its head tilted and its arms sticking out like it was reaching, was too much. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The sunlight burned away a little of the fear, and I felt stupid for letting myself get worked up. I walked back toward the patch of cut grass to look at what I had built the day before. But when I got there, it wasn't standing anymore. The pile of grass and sticks was scattered across the ground, trampled into the dirt as if something had knocked it down or dragged through it. The rocks I had used for eyes were gone. The stick arms were snapped in half. I stood there staring at the mess, trying to piece it together. Maybe the wind had blown it over. Maybe some animal had wandered through during the night. But the way the pieces were spread out, it looked less like something had toppled and more like something had been pulled apart. I didn't stay long after that. I packed my gear and left the camp, walking quickly back to where I had parked. I never told anyone about the figure or the way the night had felt. It was just a stupid thing I had made, a summertime snowman in the woods, but the feeling it gave me never went away. Even now, when I think about it, I can't shake the image of waking up in the middle of the night, hearing that faint drag in the grass, and smelling that damp, green scent through the walls of my tent. It's the kind of thing that makes you realize how quickly harmless ideas can turn into something that follows you long after. That day, I learned it's best not to shape things into people out in the woods. Once you do, they have a way of feeling like they're watching you back. I was about 14 years old when this happened, and even though decades have passed, I still remember it with a clarity that bothers me. My father had rented some farm ground in the Midwest, acres of open field with patches of woods scattered here and there, the kind of place that looks ordinary until you step deep enough into it. My older brother and I used to spend a lot of time exploring those woods, half for fun and half because we were farm kids and that's what we did. There wasn't much else to do, so we learned the land, the creeks, the low spots, the stands of trees. We had a sense of the place that felt second nature, the way you know your own yard. That familiarity made what we found even worse. It was late summer, maybe early fall, when the heat was still heavy during the day but the evenings hinted at cooler weather coming. My brother and I had been walking a stretch of woods farther from the house than we normally went. The trees were spaced just enough to let the light in, and the ground was dry, covered in dead leaves and sticks that cracked under our boots. After a while, I noticed a smell drifting through the air. It wasn't faint, not the kind of whiff you might catch and dismiss. It was thick, clinging, the kind of smell that makes the back of your throat feel raw. We both knew what it was. Growing up on a farm, you learn the difference between all the smells. Freshly turned dirt, Manure, silage, feed, the sharp bite of fertilizer. And then there's the smell of death. It has a sweetness to it, sickly and heavy, that rides the air in a way you can't mistake. Something had been dead long enough to rot, and judging by how strong it wasn't just a single rabbit or raccoon. It was something bigger or a lot of smaller things all at once. We kept walking, partly out of curiosity, partly because when you're young you push forward even when your gut tells you not to. After a while, the ground started to change. It didn't sink immediately, but it softened, like stepping on a sponge. Each step pressed water up from the soil, and the earth gave beneath us. Tall grass surrounded the area, higher than my waist, thick and pale green. We'd walked through marsh-like places before, so we knew the trick. Step carefully onto the larger clumps of grass and roots that float above the soft ground, spreading your weight. The more we walked, the stranger it felt. Normally, marshes show up in lowlands where water gathers, or near creeks and ponds. But this wasn't a low spot. The land around it sloped gently upward, and yet here was this patch of saturated earth in the middle of it. Still, we pressed on, hopping from one clump of grass to another, steadying ourselves when the ground shifted beneath. The smell grew stronger the deeper we went, so thick it clung to our clothes. Eventually, we reached a larger rise of solid ground, dry enough to feel steady underfoot. I remember standing on it, catching my breath, and then looking up. That's when I saw it. The pile was so out of place that for a second my mind didn't process what I was looking at. It rose out of the grass like some grotesque mound, easily 10 feet tall and broad enough that I'd have needed to walk several paces around it to circle the base. When I stepped closer, the details came into focus. It wasn't dirt, it wasn't brush, and it wasn't just one dead thing. It was hundreds. Animal carcasses, skinned bare, layer on top of layer, tangled together, bones jutting out at odd angles, patches of hide still clinging in spots where the knife hadn't been perfect. Rabbits, foxes, coyotes, raccoons, weasels, cats, dogs, deer. Some of them I couldn't even identify, half decayed or too mangled to tell what they once were. The sun had dried the older ones into twisted leather shapes, while newer ones oozed fluids into the pile, staining the ground around it. Flies swarmed so thickly they sounded like static. The smell was overwhelming. Not just rotten meat, but something chemical, sour, the scent of fluids soaking deep into the dirt. I stood frozen, staring at the sheer scale of it. This wasn't the work of one season, or even 1 year. The pile was too massive, too layered. It was a monument of death, built slowly over time. I knew the man who owned the land. Everyone did. He was old, weathered, with the kind of reputation you don't question. People said he trapped year-round, never cared much about limits or rules. Any animal he caught, he skinned. The pelts he sold or kept, but the bodies, now I knew where they went. He must have been dragging them here for decades, tossing them on the heap until it grew into this grotesque hill. I glanced down at the marsh around us, and it hit me then why the ground here was so strange. This wasn't a natural wetland. The soil was soaked through with the runoff of thousands of carcasses decomposing over years. Every drop of fluid, every bit of rot had seeped down, saturating the earth. That was why the grass grew so unnaturally tall here, fed by decay. The marsh wasn't formed by water, it was formed by death. Standing there, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't fear exactly, but unease that crawled under my skin. The woods we had grown up running through, the ground we thought we knew, had a place like this hidden inside it. A place shaped not by nature, but by one man's endless habit of killing and discarding. The longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. The silence of the woods pressed in, broken only by the buzz of flies. My stomach churned, and I had the urge to get away before the smell clung to me any deeper. We turned back, retracing our careful steps across the floating clumps of grass, every squelch of mud sounding louder than it should. When we finally stepped back onto firm ground away from the marsh, I remember breathing deep, but the air didn't clear it. The smell stuck in my nose, in my clothes, in my mind. Even as we walked farther and farther, I could still taste it. Later that night, lying in bed, I thought about it over and over. The pile itself was disturbing, but what lingered was the thought of the marsh. That land wasn't alive in the way woods usually are. It wasn't shaped by creeks or rains. It had been warped by years of rotting fluids seeping into the soil. The grass we stepped on, the soft earth under our boots, it was all fed by that unnatural decay. I realized then that the woods I thought I knew were not what they seemed. They had secrets buried in them, things left to rot, things left to grow out of rot. The marsh wasn't just a patch of wet ground. It was a graveyard built without care, without end. And knowing that changed the way I looked at every tree and every path on that property from that day forward. I never went back to that spot again. Not because I was scared of what I'd find, but because I already knew what was there. It wasn't just a pile of carcasses. It was years of death stacked in one place, bleeding into the soil, changing the land itself. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. I must have been around 11 years old when this happened, though the memory has never faded. Back then, my father would often take me camping. We didn't go to fancy campgrounds or places with designated sites. Instead, he liked the quiet spots, the places that weren't marked on maps. He rented some farmland and knew a lot of the back roads, and sometimes we'd just hike out into the woods and pitch our tent by a river or a stand of trees. He said it built character. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I loved being out there with him. The world felt bigger, quieter, and far from anyone else. On one of those trips, we set up camp not far from a river. It wasn't wide, more of a slow, winding body of water, the kind that snakes through farmland and tree lines. The air had that damp smell of mud and leaves, and the sound of the water moving downstream was steady, almost like a low hum in the background. We cooked over a small fire, sat around as the sun went down, and then turned in. The night passed without issue, and in the morning we decided to explore a little. We packed lightly, just a canteen and some snacks, and walked along the riverbank. The trail wasn't marked, but you could follow the natural bends of the land. I remember the ground was soft from recent rain, our boots leaving deep prints in the dirt. Birds called from the trees above, and the air was heavy with that smell of wet earth and moss. It felt normal, peaceful, the way most of our hikes did. Then, as we pushed a little farther into the woods, we came across something that stopped us both. At first, it looked like just a bit of fabric on the ground, but as we stepped closer, the shape of it became clearer. It wasn't just one thing, it was a full set of clothes. There was a shirt, folded loosely on the ground as if someone had just slipped out of it. Beside it lay a pair of pants, the cuffs damp from the soil. A pair of shoes sat nearby, laces untied, placed next to each other as though someone had stepped out of them carefully. And there was more, underwear, both pieces, lying just off to the side, pale against the dark leaves. All of it was women's clothing. I remember standing still, staring at it because something about the scene was wrong. It didn't look like clothes that had been lost or tossed aside. It looked deliberate, like someone had taken them off neatly and left them there. But there was no person in sight. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I could hear the river not far away, but around us, the birds had gone silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding still. I felt the hairs on my neck rise, though I couldn't explain why at the time. My father didn't say much, but I could tell he was unsettled. He wasn't the kind of man who got rattled easily, but his eyes scanned the trees around us, searching, as if expecting someone to appear. I kept looking, too, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone walking nearby. No voices, no movement. Just the clothes, laid out in the dirt, damp from the ground. We didn't touch them. The shirt was plain, light-colored but stained from the soil. The pants were a darker fabric, heavier, maybe denim. The shoes were scuffed but not torn, and they still looked usable. Even the underwear seemed strange to see lying there, exposed, in the middle of nowhere. Together, it made the whole thing unsettling, like we had walked into a snapshot of something we weren't supposed to find. We stood there longer than I thought we would, long enough for the unease to build. My mind tried to come up with reasons. Maybe someone had gone swimming in the river, stripped down, and left their clothes behind. But then why would they leave shoes, too? And why wasn't there any trace of them? No towels, no bags, no footprints leading away. Just silence. The river wasn't far, and I remember looking in that direction, half expecting to see someone climbing out of the water. But the surface was empty, rippling slowly with the current. There were no splashes, no movement. Eventually, my father decided we needed to report it. Back then, he carried an old flip phone when we camped, though service wasn't always reliable. I don't remember exactly how he got through, but he made a call once we hiked back closer to where service picked up. He told the state police about the clothes, gave them directions as best as he could. I expected something to happen after that, but nothing really did. Maybe they checked it out, maybe they didn't. We never heard anything about it again. For me, though, it didn't end there. That night, back at camp, I kept thinking about the scene. The shirt, the pants, the shoes, the underwear. All of it sitting in that patch of woods, so close to the river, as if someone had disappeared right out of them. The longer I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I replayed the details over and over. The way the shoes were set side by side, not tossed. The way the clothes weren't ripped or scattered, but arranged almost carefully. It didn't feel like an accident. I tried to tell myself a story that made sense. Maybe a woman had gone skinny dipping and couldn't find her way back to the spot where she left her clothes. Maybe she'd walked away barefoot and embarrassed, leaving them behind. That was the explanation my mind leaned on, because it was the only one that fit without leading somewhere darker. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't ignore what else it could mean. Clothes left like that could mean something bad had happened. Could mean someone had been forced out of them. Could mean someone had walked into the river and never come back out. At 11 years old, I didn't have the words for those thoughts, but I felt them in my gut. That uneasy silence around the clearing, the absence of birds, the heavy stillness. It all pressed on me in a way I couldn't shake. As the years went on, I thought about it less, but never forgot. The image comes back sometimes, clear as the day I saw it. A set of women's clothes, shirt and pants and underwear, laid out in the dirt, shoes sitting neatly beside them. No person in sight, no sound in the woods, just a discovery that didn't belong where it was. What unsettles me most, even now, is not knowing. If it had been a drowning or an accident or even a harmless case of someone leaving clothes behind, I feel like we would have heard something. But nothing ever came of it. No missing person report that tied back to it, no follow-up from the police, nothing to close the story. Just silence. And sometimes silence is worse than any answer. That day in the woods taught me something I hadn't known before. Nature can be wild and unpredictable, but people leave traces that can be just as haunting. A fire pit, a discarded can, or, sometimes, a set of clothes that tell a story you'll never know the ending to. Every time I camp near a river now, I think about it. I picture those clothes lying in the dirt, shoes placed side by side, as if waiting for someone who never came back. And it reminds me that the woods don't just hold animals and trees. They hold secrets too, ones you might stumble on when you least expect it. Secrets that stay with you for the rest of your life. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was boredom, maybe just the kind of restlessness that comes from being alone in the woods for too long. But that weekend, sitting out at my campsite with nothing but the sound of wind moving through the trees and the river whispering nearby, I found myself stacking rocks. It started simple, like something to pass the time, but it grew into something stranger, and by the time night came, I wished I hadn't done it at all. The spot I had picked for camping was quiet, tucked between a stand of pines and the bend of a shallow river. The ground was sandy in places, mixed with gravel and small stones, the kind that roll under your boots when you walk. I'd hiked in a couple of miles with my pack, set up my tent, and gathered enough wood to last the night. It was early summer and the days were hot, but the nights still carried a bite of cool air that made a fire necessary. By mid-afternoon, I'd eaten and had nothing left to do but sit there with the hours dragging by. That's when I noticed all the flat stones scattered along the riverbank. They were smooth, worn down by years of water running over them, the kind that stack neatly when you put one on top of the other. I started piling them up just for something to do. At first, I was building little towers, 3 or 4 stones balanced carefully on each other, nothing special. But after a while, I wanted to make something bigger, something more solid. I remembered the way kids roll snowballs to build a snowman in the winter, only here there was no snow, just rocks. That thought stuck in my head, kind of like a stone man instead of a snowman. So I picked out the bigger rocks, the heavier ones that took both hands to move. I stacked 2 of them side by side as a base, then added a larger one on top. The shapes weren't perfect, but I made them work, turning and adjusting until they balanced. Slowly, the pile started to resemble a body. I added more for shoulders, then propped a rounded one on top as a head. For arms, I found long flat stones and leaned them out to either side. By the time I was done, it stood about 5 feet tall, uneven and crude, but shaped enough like a man to be recognizable. I stepped back and looked at it. Against the backdrop of the trees, the thing stood out sharp and unnatural. It wasn't neat or symmetrical, but it was solid, looming there on the bank of the river like it had been put there for a reason. I felt a little uneasy looking at it, though I told myself it was just because I'd given it a human shape. There's something about anything man-shaped in the woods that feels wrong, like you've made a copy of yourself where it doesn't belong. The longer I stared, the less it looked like a pile of rocks and the more it seemed to stand there with weight, with presence. I turned away finally and went back to camp, but I couldn't shake the thought of it. As the sun set, the air cooled, and I built up the fire. The woods around me fell into shadow, and soon the light from the flames was the only thing holding back the dark. I cooked my food, tried to settle in, but my eyes kept drifting toward the riverbank where I knew the stone man was standing. I couldn't see it through the trees, but I knew it was there, just out of sight. The night deepened. Insects buzzed in the dark, and the occasional splash came from the river as fish jumped. But beneath those sounds, there was a strange quiet, the kind that makes your ears ring because there should be more noise than there is. I sat closer to the fire, my back to the tent, staring into the flames. At some point, I thought I heard something heavy shifting against stone. It was faint, but enough to make me freeze. It wasn't the light snap of a twig or the rustle of grass. It was weight like rocks grinding together. My skin crawled. I sat there listening, barely breathing, but the sound didn't come again. Still, I couldn't relax. I ended up stoking the fire higher than I normally would, the flames jumping and throwing sparks. I stayed up much later than usual, fighting off sleep because every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that rough stone figure standing just beyond the glow of the fire, watching. When I finally crawled into my tent, I zipped it up tight and lay there in the dark, heart still racing. The sounds of the woods pressed in, branches shifting in the wind, water moving in the river, but every so often I thought I caught that same grinding, dragging noise. I pulled my sleeping bag up even though it was too warm, as if it could shield me from what I was imagining. I don't know if I ever really slept. The night seemed endless, broken into stretches where I thought I heard movement and stretches where I told myself I was imagining things. When dawn finally came and the first light slipped through the trees, I felt more exhausted than rested. I stepped outside into the cool morning air, rubbing my eyes, and walked slowly down toward the river. My stomach twisted as I got closer, because I already had a feeling about what I would see. The stone man was gone. The rocks were scattered across the ground, spread out like something had knocked them down with force. But the way they were laid out didn't look random. They stretched out in a line, leading away from where I had built it, like the pieces had been dragged or carried. The headstone, the round one I had used, was sitting farther down by the edge of the water, balanced strangely on another rock. I just stood there staring, trying to make sense of it. Maybe some animal had pushed it over during the night. Maybe it had just collapsed on its own. But the line of stones leading away bothered me more than anything else. It didn't look like something falling. It looked like something moving. I didn't waste much time after that. I went back to camp, packed up my gear, and put out the fire. The whole time I felt watched, like the trees around me were too still, too quiet. I hiked back fast, not stopping for breaks, not looking back. Even now, I think about that stone man sometimes. It was just a stupid thing I built out of boredom, a pile of rocks shaped like a person. But the memory of sitting by the fire that night, Hearing that faint grinding sound out there in the dark still sticks with me. I'll never build anything shaped like a person in the woods again. Once you do, it doesn't feel like just a pile of stones anymore. It feels like something standing there, waiting. I set out on that trip with the idea that spring would mean thawed trails, flowing streams, and maybe a few patches of leftover snow. But Minnesota doesn't really give in to spring easily. By the time I started hiking with my pack, the ground was still coated in stubborn layers of ice and slush. The air had that sharp bite to it, the kind that nips at your nose and seeps down into your lungs with every breath. I was layered up, but no matter what, the cold seemed to work its way in. I had planned a couple of nights out there, just me and my gear, testing myself and trying to shake off the restlessness I'd been carrying all winter. Hiking alone has a rhythm to it. The crunch of my boots on packed snow, the sound of my breath puffing into the cold air, the shifting weight of the pack on my shoulders. I fell into that rhythm, focusing on the trail and the landscape around me. Bare trees with thin coats of frost stretched across rolling hills, and every so often I'd pass through a stretch of pines where the snow hung heavy on the branches. It was peaceful in the daylight, in a way that made me think the night would be just as calm. By late afternoon, I found a decent spot a little ways off the main trail, a flat patch under a few tall spruces, shielded from the wind, seemed like the best option. I set up my tent carefully, hammering the stakes into frozen ground and brushing away the crust of snow so I could lay down my sleeping pad. The air temperature started dropping quick, and I cooked a simple dinner on my small stove. Steam rose into the cold air while I ate, and the shadows stretched long and thin between the trees. When night fell, it was different than I expected. Usually in the woods, there's always something moving around. A distant coyote, the rustle of small animals, the wind moving through branches. I thought those noises would unsettle me, that being alone would make every sound feel like a threat. But as I settled into my tent and zipped the sleeping bag around me, I realized I wasn't hearing any of that. Not a single sound. It wasn't just quiet. It was silent. I noticed it right away, but at first I thought maybe I just wasn't tuned into the normal background noise yet. I lay there, holding still, waiting to hear something, anything, but there was nothing. My own heartbeat sounded louder than usual, echoing in my head. When I breathed, the air rushing in and out of my lungs seemed to fill the tent like I was the only living thing for miles. And then, when I shifted a little and a twig outside cracked under the pressure of frozen ground, the sound exploded in my ears. It was like every little noise carried farther, sharper, heavier in that silence. The longer I lay there, the more I noticed how unnatural it felt. I could normally accept coyotes howling or owls calling out, but the absence of all that made me tense. My mind kept cycling through possibilities. Maybe it was still too cold for much wildlife. Maybe the snow muffled things more than I realized. Maybe I was just overthinking. But that didn't settle the way my body reacted. I could feel the tightness in my chest, every nerve on edge, waiting. At one point, I sat up in the tent and turned off my small headlamp. Darkness folded over me completely, thick and heavy. My eyes never adjusted. No stars, no moon slipping through the clouds, just black. And in that black, the silence grew bigger. I felt small, as if the world had shrunk around me until it was just the size of my tent. When I tried to sleep, I couldn't. Every shift of the fabric, every creak of the nylon felt like it belonged to something outside. I'd turn my head, straining to hear, but there was nothing but that hollow stillness pressing in. I could almost trick myself into thinking I was inside a sealed box, cut off from everything. Sometime in the night, I realized my nerves had gotten bad enough that I was shivering, not from the cold but from the tension. I kept replaying the thought of what silence meant. Animals always make noise when they're moving. Birds chatter, squirrels dig, deer crunch through brush. The woods are alive with sound, even if you don't notice it right away. But here now, it felt like the woods weren't alive at all. I thought about predators too. Silence sometimes follows them, when everything else senses danger and goes still. That thought burrowed deep into my mind, and I couldn't shake it. At one point, I thought I heard something, a soft crack, faint but sharp in the stillness. My whole body froze, and I strained my ears until they ached. Another crack like ice shifting, then nothing again. But that nothing was worse, because now I couldn't decide if it was my imagination or if something had been close enough to make a sound. The silence that followed swallowed everything. The hours dragged. I checked my watch, thinking it had to be close to dawn, only to see that barely 20 minutes had passed. My body ached from lying so tense. My ears rang, filled with the phantom echo of the silence. When the first hint of gray touched the tent fabric, relief washed over me. I unzipped the door and crawled out. The air was bitter, stinging my nose, but at least the darkness was lifting. The forest looked different in daylight, still and calm but no longer suffocating. I stood there for a while, just breathing, watching the faint mist rise off the snow. The silence was still there though. Even in the morning, it felt off. No birdsong, no scurry of squirrels, no woodpeckers in the distance. Just the soft crunch of my boots as I packed up my gear. The quiet followed me down the trail, step after step, like an invisible weight on my shoulders. By the time I reached the trailhead, I knew I was done. I had planned for another night, maybe two, but I couldn't bring myself to stay. The silence had drained me, left me with a kind of exhaustion I couldn't explain. I'd always thought noises in the night were what made camping scary. The things that go bump, the rustles in the dark. But I learned it's the absence of sound that cuts deeper, that leaves you alone with nothing but your own heartbeat and thoughts that grow darker by the hour. Driving home, the hum of the engine and the rush of the tires over the road felt like the best sound I'd ever heard. It was a reminder that the world was still alive, still moving, still noisy. Out there in the snowy woods, in that strange and absolute silence, I felt like I had slipped into a place that wasn't meant for people. And I don't think I'll ever forget how heavy that silence was, pressing against me, mile after mile, through the long night. I had always been fascinated by old stories tied to the land, especially the ones told in the northern forests where winter clings longer than anywhere else. Before I went on that solo camping trip, I had been reading about Ojibwe folklore, and one detail stuck with me, the legend of the Wendigo. Not just as a story to scare kids, but the way it had once seeped into reality. There was even something called Wendigo psychosis, where people believed so strongly that they were turning into a Wendigo that they would beg their families to kill them or exile them before they hurt anyone. That fact lodged itself in the back of my mind, and I didn't realize just how much it would weigh on me until I was alone in the woods. I went in early spring, when the snow was still stubborn in the shaded places and the air was sharp. The trails were half frozen, slick in some spots and slushy in others. My boots sank into patches of snow, then scraped over bare roots, and I moved slowly under the tall pines and maples. The forest felt ancient, the kind of place where stories like that one had been told for generations. I didn't think much of it at first. My goal was just to get away, to test myself against the cold and the quiet, and to see how far I could go on my own. By late afternoon, I had found a clearing tucked against a ridge. It was sheltered enough from the wind that I figured it would be a decent place to spend the night. I stamped down the snow and pitched my small tent, the bright fabric looking out of place against the dark trees. I boiled some water, ate a quick meal, and watched the shadows stretch longer across the snow. As darkness came, I felt the shift. The forest lost its detail, and everything pressed in closer. The cold seemed sharper, the stillness heavier. I climbed into my sleeping bag, letting the warmth build slowly around me. That was when the silence really settled in. At first I thought it was normal. Snow muffles sound, and the air was calm without wind. But after an hour or so, I realized just how complete it was. No owls calling, no rustle of small animals, not even the groan of trees shifting. I could hear my heartbeat thumping inside my ears, my breath moving in and out, the faint creak of nylon as I shifted. Every small noise I made seemed too loud, like it didn't belong. And that's when the story I'd been reading before the trip began to surface in my thoughts. Wendigo psychosis, people convinced they were becoming monsters, terrified of themselves, trapped in silence and cold. I thought about how those winters must have been back then. Longer, harsher, darker than what I was facing. People snowed in, starving, with nothing but the sound of their own body for company. It didn't take much imagination to picture how silence like this could break a mind. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. The silence was too heavy. Every time my mind started to drift, I jolted awake with the thought that something was missing. Sound itself was missing. I started to notice the way my thoughts were circling, going back again and again to that same idea, that maybe this kind of silence was the same silence that drove people into believing they were cursed. At one point, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, hoping some air would clear my head. The forest was frozen solid in the moonlight. The snow reflected faint silver. The trees stood in rigid black lines, and not a single branch moved. I stood there, my breath steaming, and felt like the world had stopped spinning. That stillness got under my skin. My brain kept saying, "You're alone, completely alone. Nothing else is alive out here." I climbed back into the tent, but it didn't help. My body wouldn't relax. My jaw clenched until it ached. My hands curled tight inside the sleeping bag. I kept thinking about how easy it would be to lose yourself in that kind of silence. How, if you let it go long enough, you might start to hear things that weren't there just to fill the void. I thought about the people who'd begged their families to kill them, convinced they were dangerous. I thought about how the human mind wasn't built for total silence. It needed noise, movement, something. Otherwise, it turned inward, chewing on itself. The hours dragged. My watch glowed faint green when I checked it. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2. Every time I looked, I swore the minutes had stretched twice as long as they should. My ears strained so hard for sound that they rang. Every now and then I thought I caught something. A faint crack, a whisper of movement, but the silence always swallowed it before I could be sure. That was the worst part, the not knowing if it was real. By the time the first pale light crept into the tent, I felt hollowed out. I hadn't slept more than a few minutes here and there. My muscles were stiff, my mind foggy, and the silence was still there. Even with daylight filtering in, the forest gave nothing back. I unzipped the tent and packed quickly, my hands numb from both cold and fatigue. Hiking back toward the trailhead, I kept listening, waiting for normal sounds to return. For a bird call, for the chatter of a squirrel, for even the distant crack of ice shifting. Nothing came. My own boots were the only thing I heard crunch, crunch, crunch through the snow. It made the hike feel endless, like I was moving through a frozen bubble where time and sound didn't work anymore. When I finally reached the parking lot, the sound of my car door closing startled me so badly I jumped. The slam echoed in my chest, and I realized how much I had been starving for noise. When the engine turned over, the low rumble filled me with a relief I can't really describe. It was like stepping out of a coffin. Driving back, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had felt out there. I had gone in expecting maybe to hear coyotes or branches snapping in the night, and instead I'd faced something worse, the total absence of life. The silence had pressed on me so hard that it crawled into my head, twisted my thoughts, and made me understand how those old stories took root. I didn't need a monster in the woods. The mind could build its own out of nothing but stillness and fear. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew one thing for sure. I could handle noises in the night, but I never wanted to face that kind of silence again. Out there, in the frozen woods with no sound at all, I'd brushed against the edge of something I didn't want to touch again. The realization of how easily the human mind can start to unravel when it has nothing but itself to listen to.